Okay, great. Okay, a very good evening to all of you. So it's been a long day, but I'm sure you're going to find this session quite interesting and useful. As I sent a mail to all of you this morning, IRMA is hosting a big international conference from the November 16 to 18. The theme, can I have your attention, please? The theme is called Managing Sustainable Transitions in Agriculture, Newer Directions for Research and Civic Action. So a little bit about the conference itself. The conference is being organized in collaboration with the Network of Rural and Agrarian Studies and IIT Delhi. The Network of Rural and Agrarian Studies, we're going to hear more about it in today's presentation. Vijayshankar has been with NRAS right from its inception, probably since 2010 or so. I've been part of it. I didn't go for the first one or two conferences, but this is like a traveling conference that goes to different parts of India. And it was a very conscious decision taken at the early stages not to have these at the centers like in Delhi or in Bombay, etc., but to try and reach out to as many institutions with a local host and researchers working broadly on rural and agrarian India, who could be sociologists, economists, and others, along with research scholars, participate in this conference. So we are hosting this conference for the first time at IRMA. This is an international conference. We've had a very good response for this conference. Most of you, I gather your batch, are from an agriculture background. Something like 60-65%, am I correct? Yeah. So what we're going to talk about in the conference is this whole thing about how do you manage a transition to sustainable agriculture. And today's talk is actually going to be a little bit about what's the context for this shift? Why do we have to talk about it in today's, in the Indian context? So what we're going to do today is I'll just provide a very brief introduction to both Richa and Vijay, or Viju as he's called. How many of you who are here from Madhya Pradesh? About 6 or 7. Anyone from the Malwa region? Not the Punjab Malwa. We're talking about the Madhya Pradesh Malwa. Okay. So, Vijayshankar is one of the founder members of the Samaj Pragati Sahyog, which was started by a group of urban-bred intellectuals, so to speak, from different persuasions, where they decided to go to Devas and set up this institution. It came during the whole discussion about the Narmada Valley being affected, issues of displacement and so on. It's around that time that this institution got set up. Vijay has a degree from CDS Trivandrum. Lots of people from Kerala, I guess. Yes. And Vijay has hosted, or Viju has hosted some of our students at SPS in the past where they did their field work. I had opportunity to visit some of the students that time as well. And many IRMAs have worked in SPS in different capacities. The latest one being somebody, who was the CEO of the farmer producer company that was promoted by SP. So this is just a brief introduction to Vijay. He's just gone off at the right time. Can I have some support? Anish, can you just play the PPT? Yeah, so what we're going to do is both Vijayshankar and Richa have written books. So, yeah, as you can see, Dr. Vijayshankar and many of the other colleagues have brought out a very useful report on tribal development, which we hope will get to a library soon. It was released in 2022, along with members of the Bharat Rural Livelihood Foundation. And I'd like to briefly talk to you also about this book by Dr. Richa Kumar. This is based on her PhD, and the book is called Rethinking Revolutions, Soybean, Chopals, and the Changing Countryside in Central India. So what we'll do is maybe start off this conversation by asking both, starting with Viju, can you tell us briefly about the Tribal Development Report, what the book is all about?
Can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay. This Tribal Development Report was conceptualized in 2017. It was thought that the BRLF, as you know, Bharat Rural Livelihood Foundation, organization which was formed fairly recently, is focusing on the Central Indian tribal tribal areas. So the report was trying to analyze. This is the first volume of the report, edited by Dr. Mirsha and myself. So this report tried to look at the problems of the Central Indian tribal areas in particular, and their livelihoods, how their levels of human development, and a little bit on their culture and art and those kind of things also. And it took some time. We actually got papers written by very noted experts in different fields, and putting them together and finally publishing them with the COVID interruption as well took a lot of time. Finally, it was published by Routledge last year, and the copy that I'm showing you right now is the international edition. Unfortunately, it is very, very highly, one should say, obscenely priced. I mean, nobody can buy it except libraries like IRMA or somebody like that. Nobody else can buy it. But now a South Asia edition is coming out. I think it's going to come out either this month or next month, which will be much cheaper. And I would request you to look at it. It's quite interesting in parts, not because we have edited it or I have written it, but some articles in that are quite interesting. They sort of center stage the problem of tribals in India, I think, which is very, very less understood. Yeah, it's in 2 volumes. We can talk more about it in the conference when we get an opportunity. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Viju. Our participants are not going to be in the conference because they're in the field. But I'm just requesting you, if there's some article or a piece that maybe they can take with them, we'd be happy to share. On why do you look at tribal development differently? Even if possible, the introductory chapter or any such thing that you have, which Mihir and you have written, that would be quite helpful.
So, yeah, I can share the introduction of the report, which is talking about the whole report, actually, written by Mihir and myself. Yeah.
Yeah, so I guess some of you will be visiting tribal areas during your BFS. So, understanding the context of it will be quite helpful. I'd like to just briefly talk to you about this very fascinating work by Dr. Richa. Dr. Richa is Associate Professor at the Indian Institute of Technology, Delhi. She did a PhD from MIT in Boston, and her PhD was on understanding the very famed story of ITC each of us. And her title of this book is about the story of soybean, how it got introduced in many parts of Madhya Pradesh. And there were cooperatives that also helped in this. And what's been the impact of, or at some level, how do different farmers groups look at all of this whole commodity and the markets and all of that. So, Richa, my question to you is, how did the field change your understanding of the issue? Because you spent a lot of time in the field. Can you just tell us briefly, because all of them are going to the field shortly?
Sure. Are you able to hear me now?
Absolutely.
Okay. So actually, when I went in to do my field work, it was, as Professor Shambu mentioned, it was to look at these e-chopals. And the idea was that, we are going to look at new technologies information and communication technologies and see what they can do for rural villagers, what they can do for agricultural markets. How do we get people in the villages to use these computers? And we wanted to study what was happening. I wanted to study that. But going to the field, it became, pretty obvious at that point of time that the computers were really on one side and there was a lot else going on. The book broadly is divided into two sections. The first part looks at soybean itself as a technology. So looking at seeds and the entire infrastructure of science and technology around agriculture, and what implications that has had for people's lives. And then the second half looks at the role of corporations or companies like ITC, IBD, which set up the e-chopals, and looks at the mandi system, intermediaries, looks at agrarian markets, to understand how they have been transformed over time in the last 40, 50 years in central India. And in some ways, the book very simply argues that, very often we sitting in urban India feel, and especially in research institutes, and I say this is very true sometimes of IIT Delhi also, we look at problems from our perspective, we come up with these solutions, we have these technologies, and then we feel, oh, let's get people in rural India to use them. But one of the biggest learnings for me was that, well, people in rural India have their own way of looking at the world, their own sets of problems and concerns. And rather than this very top-down, we are the expert, they need to receive our knowledge. One really has to understand the world. That's what fieldwork is. Participant observation. You go into the field and understand the world from your informant's point of view. And emerging from that, actually, I would say is what the work that we are trying to present today, what has shaped also the findings of the NRAS. That two of the biggest issues that I have been grappling with after coming back from the field are concerns around health and nutrition. Because one of the things I found that even though we had all of this, agricultural growth and supposedly a lot of this prosperity, people's health was really, really bad, and malnutrition and now obesity has become a rising problem in our country. And the other concern was around toxicity and pesticides, and how do we deal with that? So while we may have all this growth and productivity, what are the consequences of it on our own bodies, on our environment? Those are the very big questions that emerged coming back from the field.
Thank you so much, Richa, and Viju for kind of setting the stage. I also take this opportunity to invite many of the participants of the conference who are attending online. They are in the process of revising their papers, and this is a document which is, of course, the State of Rural and Agrarian India report is available online, and maybe invite them to also engage with some of the issues mentioned in this report. So my request to all the participants online, if you have any queries, please use the chat window, the Q&A process there, and we'll get on. So the way we planned today's evening's discussion, we'll take about 30 to 35 minutes listening to the report. And I think it's a big report, but it has a lot of visual elements. Some of you can download it as well. It's more an introduction to this report that is going to be provided. We are not joined today by Dr. Vasavi. She's also an integral member of NRAS, and she has shared with us a report in Kannada. So those of you from Karnataka, we'll be happy to send you the Kannada report as well. So some of you can take it to the field and have discussion. It's not necessarily that we agree with everything in the report, but it's important for us to know how are some of these ideas being formed, what are the implications of this for soil health, nutrition, and ecology, etc. So without any further ado, let's get started with the presentation. And I invite Richa and Viju to, share their insights from the report. Yeah. So just tell us when we need to change the slide and we do so. Yeah, we can go to the next one.
Shambu, I can't see the report myself.
I don't think you've done screen share. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah.
Viju, you don't need to see the report.
I know, but I should
slides, yeah.
talk about what is there on the screen, not about something else altogether. Okay, Richa, all yours. Start.
Yeah. So now you're able to see it, right?
Yes. Thank
Please
you.
go ahead.
Right. So let me actually begin. We can actually move to the first slide. Sorry, the next slide. I'll probably give you a bit of a brief about the network of rural and agrarian studies, but I think I want to begin with this idea of the Green Revolution. I'm assuming you all are familiar with the Green Revolution, 1960s. It is hailed as a paradigm shift in agriculture in our country. This is a high productivity regime. We got in a package of high yielding variety seeds, water, fertilizers, and the idea was that we need to ramp up productivity of our farms, grow more food, grow more cereals to feed our people. And this was a watershed in the history of agriculture in India. Now, what this meant over time as different states in the country, as farmers adopted these green revolution practices, and typically they were targeted at farmers who had higher level of capital because it required investment, where irrigated areas of the country were targeted first. So you had select regions in Punjab, Western UP, Haryana, Andhra Pradesh, parts of Tamil Nadu, West Bengal, where these technologies and these seeds were provided initially. This has eventually turned out to be a very fragile and high risk model of agriculture. And I'll explain that as we go on and later on in here, what we mean by the technological treadmill, what kind of environmental damage this model may have caused, and how that is now compounded with climate change in terms of the implications of this for farmers and their ability to farm in the future. So in the last decade or so, I'm assuming many of you would have definitely heard of a whole variety of farmers' protests. The most famous, of course, is the one from 2020 with the protest against the 3 farm laws. But even before that, there was a long march in Mumbai. There were other protests in Delhi, protests in Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan, Gujarat, many other parts of the country, effectively expressing agrarian distress and rural distress. In some ways making the point that the model of agriculture that we are following is no longer working. It's not working, certainly not for the environment that I'm sure you guys are familiar with. And I'll talk about that, showing you a little bit of data in terms of implications for the environment. But it's also not working for farmers in terms of this technological treadmill that they are stuck on and the great deal of indebtedness that they are undertaking. So there are input costs. You have to buy these seeds, pay for water, fertilizers. You need pesticides because now you have pests that are attacking your crop. So this whole monoculture logic of farming, which is about growing a single crop on your farm, is what has put farmers on this kind of technological treadmill. And it is very, very risky because you have a risk of crop failure, but you also have risk of market failure. So all of this has compounded in the last 20, 30 years. We've seen growing cases of farmer suicides. And as I mentioned, what I saw was continuing undernutrition, rising healthcare costs, now issues also in terms of toxicity related to pesticides. All of these issues have emerged. I now want to sort of take a step back and talk about how this network of rural and agrarian studies came about. So all of these issues, they were there. We have to stay on the same slide, on the Green Revolution slide. So in the decade of the 90s and 2000s, in many parts of the country, post-liberalization, there was a real shift away from studies of rural and agrarian India. If you go back in, perhaps some of you have looked at literature in the 60s and 70s, there were a lot of village studies, there were a lot of studies on the Green Revolution. And then eventually interest petered out, funding dried out, people started looking at urbanization, various other things. And it was in this particular environment where farmer suicides were peaking and a lot of rural distress was coming through, that some of us decided to come together and put together this network of rural and agrarian studies, with the aim being that we need people to study rural problems, agrarian issues, and in some ways we need to become a voice of people from these margins within academia. And we've held several, biannual conferences, as Professor Shambu mentioned. We try to do it in non-metro cities, and we try to work with institutions and especially work with students. So we have a mentoring program that runs along with our conferences, where we try and encourage students working on these issues to then write up their work and present and publish it. And after about a decade of working together, we had a conference in 2019 at IIT Delhi, in fact, where we tried to bring about all of our learnings in some ways to talk about what kind of policy regime change is required. What are the ways in which the government or the state is responding to this crisis, and what is in fact required? And that's how this report actually came about. And it's very interesting that it came about at the time of the protests against the 3 farm laws. So the report has been translated, as was mentioned, into 3-4 languages that's been published already in those languages. And we're trying to enable it to generate discussions around an alternative model for agriculture. So in sum, that's what we're going to try and do today, Vijayshankar and I, where we'll try and briefly explain the current model, what are the problems with the current model, and then give you a peek into the kind of alternatives. If you look at the report, much of this is in greater detail. So we can now move on to the next slide. The report centers around these 2 ideas of productivity and populism. And I'll very briefly explain productivity. I'm assuming you guys are familiar with. The logic is that we need to enhance yield per acre. So we need yield at the cost of anything. And what it basically means that the assumption underlying this is that natural resources, whether it is the soil, water, whatever is in the environment and nature, is available for continuous extraction. The idea is that there is no limit to growth. That's the assumption behind the productivity logic, that we can keep doing this as much as we want, possibly, and we can think about agriculture as an enterprise outside of nature, outside of the limits of nature. And whether we look at GM technologies, high yielding varieties, hybrid technologies, all of it, the monoculture paradigm essentially is about enhancing productivity in effectively any cost. And this has been done in the Green Revolution through active state support with input subsidies, output guarantees, buying at MST, a lot of other things that the state has handheld farmers in moving them to this model from a different model in the past, which was effectively about growing many things on your farm at the same time. Now, as I mentioned, this model of the Green Revolution has created a crisis, and we'll talk about some data related to the crisis later. But what has been the state's response to this crisis? The state's response has been what we characterize using the term populism, where the state has been trying to support agricultural communities through some kind of subsidy or input or output support. So the most recent example would be, for example, the PM Kisan, which gives 6,000 rupees per farmer, goes into their bank account. But one of the biggest concerns, while it's very important to recognize that many of these measures are very important and necessary as welfare measures, because farmers are truly in a crisis situation. What we saw in 2020-21 at the borders of Delhi shows the desperation of farmers and shows the kind of indebtedness that they are suffering from. So many of these populist measures are necessary to save farmers effectively from total ruination. But they don't quite recognize the broader logic of agriculture, which effectively is about public investment and a collective planning around what needs to be done. As individual farmers, it's very difficult for them to transform their practices to make them either more sustainable or ecologically resilient, or get out of the trap of indebtedness. But if they are able to work in some form of collective, these things become far more possible, because agriculture has to be understood at a landscape level. It cannot be understood at the level of individual farms. And that's something we'll talk about further towards the end. Next slide, please. This particular photo is actually from one of the farmer protests in Delhi. And, it talks about, very recently also there have been these slogans that we feed the world, but who's going to feed us and who's going to take care of us? And this is very classically represented in, that Louisian logic that some of you may be familiar with. That, agriculture is always the residual. Agriculture is backward. Agriculture is redundant. Farmers' children don't want to be farmers, and nobody else wants to be farmers either. the logic is that, the rural is either a source of raw materials, it's a destination for products, and definitely a destination for a lot of urban waste. And this kind of extractive process is acceptable because the rural is really not necessary. The rural is not part of the future. It's the urban modernization, industrialization logic that is the logic of the future. And this is one set of key assumptions that we are trying to challenge through the kind of work we are doing at the NRAS. We'll move to the next slide, please. I now want to briefly share some data around the implications or the consequences of the Green Revolution model of farming around the country. And the first one is on land degradation. This is very important because if your land is degraded, your soil is degraded, you really can't grow anything much on it. Apart from the fact that a lot of farmland now is getting diverted for urban purposes, so much of land now, I'm sure you guys are familiar, is far better valued as real estate rather than actually in terms of productivity or as an agricultural crop. But even in terms of the land left in agriculture, about between 38 to 45% of our India's land is now degraded. Next slide, please. Loss of soil health is very critically related to this. One of the things that the Green Revolution focused on was improving nitrogen uptake of specific seed varieties. And broadly, the logic was a chemical logic. What we wanted to do was analyze soil for its chemical properties, and this is what the soil health card also does. And we wanted to add in whatever chemicals were missing into the soil. But this chemical logic ignored entirely the biological and the physical logic of soils. Because you cannot have good soil which is fertile and productive unless you actually have a soil that is living. You need microbes, you need organic matter, which is carbon, and both of these work together to enhance the moisture holding capacity of the soil. And until and unless you have living soils, your productivity over time is going to go down. And this is exactly what we have seen over time. As we put chemicals in the soil, the life in the soil died. And as the life in the soil died, the microbes died, the productivity of your chemicals also reduced. So over time, you needed to put more and more chemicals for the soil to give the same amount of output. And that you can see in the graph on the bottom, which is the decreasing the fertilizer response rate in irrigated areas, where you need to put more and more fertilizer to achieve the same amount of yield. Next slide, please. The other implication has been on biodiversity and the loss of our genetic heritage. And this is very, very important in the context of climate change today. So if you see the graph here, the different colors on the left side are showing the different kinds of crops that farmers in Punjab grew. And I want to spend a little bit of a moment on this particular slide, because what you see there is pulses, oilseeds, and multiple cereals, which were primarily millets of many kinds. Now, this millet, oilseed, pulses cropping system about growing many things on the farm, mixed cropping them at a given moment in time, and then growing multiple things across the seasons was a very ecologically suitable way of farming. And that's exactly what the Green Revolution broke. So you can see everything else disappeared. All that is left is rice, wheat, and now a little bit of cotton. And the other interesting thing is you can see the growth in rice. The red band at the bottom is the enormous growth in rice. Rice was not a very important crop, or hardly a crop in Punjab if you take this graph back to the 1950s. But now rice, Punjab is the home for rice, basmati rice. And apart from the fact that we have lost a lot of seed varieties, I have a slide later on about water. We are growing rice, which is a water-intensive crop in a region like Punjab, which is a semi-arid sort of region, doesn't have that much water, and we are exporting all of that groundwater with all the basmati rice exports that we are doing. So this is hugely damaging, because 10, 20 years later, where is the water going to come from for people to even drink? Forget about trying to farm using that water. These are some very major questions that are emerging from this particular model of the Green Revolution. Next slide, please. This, I think you all must be familiar with. This is a farmer spraying pesticides. The amount of pest attacks and crop losses due to pest attacks have grown exponentially, and what along with that has also grown is chemical companies and the profits of chemical companies. Because in some ways, it's like, you use a medicine, you kill certain pests, but the big fat pests amongst them, they survive. And then you need bigger and more potent chemicals to kill those pests. And then effectively, then your medicine doesn't work anymore. So then you need a better chemical formula. And so chemical companies have found it really, really helpful in many ways to keep making newer and more potent pesticides, which are more and more expensive. So this is one of the logics of the technological treadmill, where farmers are having to spend more money to buy more expensive pesticides, but are still seeing more and more impact due to crop losses. And there's a very interesting story around BT cotton and the impact on pesticides, which I'm happy to take in the Q&A and talk about that further. Next slide, please. This is the data on groundwater. And if you can see the graph, the map on the right of your screen, the one which is the white background with India, you can see in there the scarcity and the decline in groundwater availability, especially in Punjab, in the northwestern part of the country. This data shows the kind of water stress that we are facing in our country. And with climate change, this is simply going to become much, much worse. Next slide, please. This is data specifically on temperature, and globally, of course, temperatures have been on the rise. We have already seen close to 1 degree centigrade rise in temperature, and I want to share just one very brief and important data point with all of you. Before the Industrial Revolution, about 1850, 1870 or so, the amount of carbon dioxide equivalent greenhouse gases in the atmosphere were about 280 parts per million. And today, as of 2023, we have now nearly hit 420 parts per million. These numbers are quite astounding. I've been teaching in the last decade or so, and when I first taught about climate change, we were at 412. And so in a decade, we have jumped up. The kinds of emissions of greenhouse gases are going up so alarmingly. And despite all of the international agreements, despite the Paris Agreement, we are clearly on our way to much, we are certainly not going to be sticking to either 450 parts per million. We are clearly on our way to breaching that mark. And the implications for India are disastrous in terms of the implications for the glaciers in the Himalayas, with glacial melt, the kind of flooding that we've been seeing with cloudbursts and extreme weather events, whether it's floods, whether it's droughts, it's heat waves. But our entire Indo-Gangetic plain is at risk of extreme drought and water stress. If the glaciers are going to disappear, we will not have water in the Indian north. And if the Indian monsoon is affected and the cycles are messed up, then life on India is going to be hard on our subcontinent. So these are some very, very serious issues that we must grapple with. I will urge all of you all to please spend some time looking at the IPCC reports, trying to understand climate change and talk about it to as many more people as you can, because we really need to collectively do something about this. I think it's now over to you, Viju.
Thank you, Richa. Richa has spoken a lot about the impact of our agriculture, the kind of agriculture that we are following after Green Revolution on the environment and all. In a rather frightening story she has unfolded. I'll now leave the environment and probably get into the people who are actually suffering the impact of all these things more than any one of us sitting in this room, which is the farmers. I'm trying to speak something about the condition of farmers in India, particularly the smallholder farmers. But before we leave environment, I'd like to show one more book at the cost of publicizing myself. Another book which we have written. This is a kind of edited volume for Orient Black Swan, and it's titled Water, the Growing Understanding and Emerging Perspectives. Again, done by Dr. Mirsha and myself. We collected all the articles which came out in the Economic and Political Weekly. So in that, there are a couple of articles on groundwater, and much more work has happened. There's one paper written by me and some other colleagues in 2011, which showed that the groundwater situation in India is quite bad, and probably 10 years down the line, it may have got even more worse. So a lot of the frightening stuff that Richa is saying is quite true and quite visible in front of us. But what is more interesting is to, or equally interesting, is to look at what the farmers are doing. Who are these people that we are talking about? Kisan बोल रहे हैं. So I can use Hindi also as a Hindi speaking people. तो आप बोलेंगे कि तो किसान के बारे में बात करेंगे. Who are the farmers? किसान कौन है? इसके बारे में वो किस टाइप का किसान की हमें बात कर रहे हैं. So if you look at India's data, which is there on the slide, I am told that you are not able to read the text, but you can largely ignore that. You can listen to what I'm saying and look at the visible if it makes visual if it makes sense to you. So in the proportion of people dependent on agriculture who are engaged in agriculture as a workforce, as a proportion of the total workforce has gone down in India from about 70 to around 44. The 48 is a slightly old data. Most recent figure will be around 44%. Still, it is quite substantial. So agriculture as a major livelihood, if you look at it in rural areas, it continues to be one of the major livelihoods even today. And we have more recent surveys which showing the percentage of farmers or agricultural households is something like 54% of the total rural households. So this is quite significant kind of people we are talking about as farmers. But in that farmers, if you look at it, there are big and small. It's a mixed category. So if you look at that way, next slide, can we go to the next slide? Next slide, please. Yeah. If you look at this thing, average size of holding, which is the total land available divided by the number of holdings, that has been steadily been coming down. And as per the latest information that we have in 2015-16, the size was around 1 hectare. 1 hectare in Madhya Pradesh terminology, it would be 4 bighas or 2.5 acres or something. It's a very small piece of land. That is what the farmers have on an average. And the figure is also that 80% of the farmers are those who own 2 hectares or less than that, are in the category what we normally call as a smallholder farmer or a small and marginal farmer category. So 80% of the farmer, 85% of the farming population in India are in the small and marginal category. And they together collectively are cultivating something like 45, let's say 50% of the land in the country. So those are the farmers that we are really talking about. So whether you talk about groundwater depletion, whether you talk about climate change, whether you talk about pesticide impact, whether you talk about rising cost of cultivation, whether you talk about farm loss, it is the smallholder farmers who are going to be most affected by all the phenomena that Richa has so eloquently described. So how do these farmers survive and what is the kind of options available for them? In the report, we spent some time on this. And we found many interesting things. There was one point in the previous slide, which is about migration. If you look at the farmers who are migrating, you find many of the smallholder farmers are also migrating. Normally, migration is associated with farm labor. So you find that if you examine the migration data, you find that the people who are migrating, there are many more farmers, smallholder farmers also. So that's a mix of things. So if you actually go deeper into the question, we'll find that the boundaries between farmer and agricultural labor is gradually diminishing or disappearing, dissolving. You have the phenomenon of smallholder farmers also doing wage work in the fields of their neighbors or even migrating to distant areas to make their ends meet. So the fate of the smallholder farmers covering around 85% of the population is very, very alarming, and that we should be thinking about it independently. And with all the factors in the nature and climate and all that happening together, the situation of smallholder farmers is going to be much more precarious in future. And one related point, that is the role of women. I think we can take it up in the Q&A. It's a very large issue. When you talk about migration, again, just like you ask the question, who is the farmer? You should ask, who is the migrant? The migrants are normally the male members. So what happens is that when a village or in a semi-urban kind of situation, the men go to larger towns or other villages even in search of work, and women are left in the villages, and they basically get into agriculture. So you have a phenomenon called feminization of agriculture. Agriculture is becoming increasingly feminine. Women are participating in agriculture much more than men, which I think if you go to rural areas, you will clearly see. Next slide, please. Yeah. Now a bit more on the smallholder farmer situation. As I mentioned, the boundaries between wage labor and agriculture, farmer, these are increasingly getting dissolved. And similarly, the boundaries between a livestock farmer, a migrant farmer, and somebody who's dependent on a forest produce, all these are getting very, very mixed up. There was a survey by NABARD, I think a few days back, a few years back, in which they looked at multiple livelihoods, which the same household is trying to do. So they found that normal household, like a smallholder household, combines 2 or 3 or even 4 types of livelihoods in there to make their ends meet. They do seasonal farming, they do agricultural labor in the fields of others, they migrate when there's no work in the village, they go to the forest to collect forest produce, or they tend to animals. So income of the farmers, particularly smallholder farmers, is derived from multiple sources. So what you show is that the big pie, which is shown there, that large portion of the pie, 63%, is income from cultivation, but that's all. And the remaining 37% of the income of the farming households come from activities other than direct cultivation. This is slightly dated information. We have a more recent table in the next slide. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is from the latest National Sample Survey Organization's study called Situation Analysis of Agricultural Households, SAAH. You'll encounter this name if you are interested in farming issues a lot more, because this is, to my mind, the last comprehensive assessment of farmers in how farmers in India are doing. So the figures, let's spend time on this table and let's look at the table a bit closely. We are not talking about only farmers, we are talking about what they define as agricultural households, defined as people who derive a major portion of their income from agriculture. We are not talking about rural households in general, we are talking about farming or agricultural households. We find that average income of an agricultural household in India is around 10,000 rupees. This fact one should think. There's a lot of debate about MSPs, securing farmer income, income transfers, PM Kisan Yojana, which I think I'll also be mentioning, which we can take it as part of populism if you like. But the issue is that the average income of a farmer in India, a kisan ka average income in the country is 10,000 rupees. 10,000 रुपए आज सरकारी दफ्तर में काम करने वाला the lowest grade person also will be getting more than that. That is the kind of income that farmers are having. And is this entire income coming out of farming? उसका ब्रेकअप देखेंगे तो और भी इंटरेस्टिंग है. इसमें आपको ये दिखेगा कि 40%, इसका लगभग 40% of the total income is coming out of wage labor. We are talking about farmers, we are not talking about agricultural labor. We are talking about farmers who own land, cultivate land, and derive a major part of their income from land. So we have talked about landless laborers. So now we have a situation in front of us, what is called landed laborers. People have land, but जो बाहर जाके काम कर रहा है. क्यों करना पड़ रहा है? Because उनका holding छोटा है. And whatever income they get is not sufficient to meet their daily expenses. 10,000 rupees is not sufficient. So they are trying to do multiple livelihoods to make the ends meet. So income from crop production, farming per se, comes in the second number, 37%, and income from wage labor has overtaken. In the last survey, previous survey, it was not like that. Previous survey was done in 2013. There the figure was slightly different, but the latest information, wage labor has become the most important source of income, even for farming households, which means that's the crisis that farming is facing in India. And there are other kinds of income, livestock income, all those things are mentioned there. Next slide. So in this kind of situation, what do the farmers do normally? We hear about various things. We hear about rural unemployment. गांव में बेरोजगारी है. But do you find anybody sitting idle in the village? If you actually go and talk to anybody, do anybody say, मेरे पास कोई काम नहीं है, मैं तो फालतू बैठा हूँ, I'm just sitting, I don't have any work? Nobody says that. As John Ray, the famous economist, said recently, unemployment is a luxury which a rural poor cannot afford. They have to do some work or the other. Partial employment होगा, कुछ दिन के लिए होगा, migrate करके होगा, 4 दिन के लिए होगा, जो भी है. They have to do some work. So unemployment, what you're talking about is open unemployment. There is a lot of other type of unemployment, what in economics called disguised unemployment. प्रच्छन्न बेरोजगारी जो बोलते हैं, जो आदमी बेरोजगार है लेकिन दिखता नहीं है. Why? To do a work in a 1 hectare piece of land, 2.5 acres of land, you basically require 2 people maximum or 3 people. There are 5 people in the village working there on that thing. So that remaining 2 people who is required more than what the surplus labor more than what is required is actually the what you call the disguised unemployed persons. And they are unemployed in agriculture, staying in agriculture because non-agriculture opportunities have not developed. That's a very long story. We'll not get in there. Basically, one can say that open employment figures may be low, but in agriculture, there is overcrowding. There's a lot more people than what is required. Agriculture currently produces around 16% of the national income, but around 50% of the people are working in agriculture. So there is definitely a issue of surplus labor in agriculture, which is much more than the employment figures show. Now, coming back to smallholder farmers, if they are able to, their income level is low, they are trying to do multiple livelihoods, trying to make the ends meet. If they fall short, what are they likely to do? They are likely to borrow. So we come to the situation of debt. The data again shows that 52% of the
agriculture. Sorry to interrupt you.
Sorry?
Sorry to interrupt you. Can you wind up in 4 or 5 minutes?
Yes, I'll yeah. Just the previous slide, just stay on the previous slide, but yeah. I'll just do it in 5 minutes, yeah. So if you look at this thing, 52% of the farming households are in debt. They're heavily indebted, in debt, and the debt forces them to do many things like farmer suicides and all that, which we can discuss. Next slide, please. In our report, we spend time looking at the sources of debt. Where are the farmers borrowing from? We talk about smallholder farmers or farmers in general borrowing from wherever. So we find that after bank nationalization, which was a major event which happened some 50 years ago, even after that, 50 years after that, 5 decades after that, the informal sources of credit like money lenders are still a major source in the rural areas, and their share has come down definitely, but still is quite significant. So a lot of farmers are incurring debt at a very high cost. This could be data Sarkari sources mein hai. If you look at it, you can find that the rate of interest on loans taken by smallholder farmers is phenomenally high. So this again puts farmers into many deep situations. Next slide, please. And this is a very clear example of that. The extreme case of that, there are 2 extreme cases. One extreme case is that of farmer suicides. Some 3 lakh farmers are supposed to have committed suicide according to the data of the government. Government does not collect this data. This data is collected by the National Crime Bureau. That their information show that so many farmers, for committing suicide in India is a crime. Living is not, but committing suicide definitely is a crime. So this is the kind of numbers that we come out with. So many people have committed suicide, and we keep hearing news about that. This is one extreme form of response to rural distress or the kind of condition that the farmers are in right now. The other extreme is, of course, what you call the right-wing extremism or Naxalism or Maoism or whatever. People, because they have no other solution to their problems, they take to guns. And they create violence, disrupt the normal life according to conventional media. And the root of that also is growing farming distress. So our report tried to cover various aspects of that a lot. And it also tried to look at different types of farmers. In addition to the smallholder farmers we talked about, there's a huge category of tenant farmers. जो बटाईदार जो बोलते हैं या जो sharecroppers है, people take land from other people's land and cultivate. And there's a huge category, a very least understood category called women. Women are not understood as farmers. There's a lot of stories about that. We can talk about the producer company that we created. When we tried to market, they said, who are these women? They are not farmers. They're not farmers because zameen to hai nahi. If you don't own land, you are not considered a farmer. So you have a huge category of women farmers in India who are actually doing all farming. As we mentioned earlier, feminization is a major issue. But there is no land in their name, and therefore they are not considered farmers. So those issues also we have gone into the report. For more details, we can consult the report itself. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is my last slide. After that, I'll hand over back to Richa to outline the kind of options. Here's a problem, what could be the way forward? If you look at when you compare this populism versus productivity kind of debate that we are having, we find that increasingly populism is what we call populism is being adopted by many people, many governments, state governments. A simple example is there in Madhya Pradesh. I'm sitting in Madhya Pradesh in Bhopal. The Kisan Samman Yojana, the kind of pension, the kind of cash transfer to farmers is by central government is 6,000 rupees. What our state government, our own Chief Minister, Mr. Shivraj Singh Chauhan has done, he has added 6,000 rupees to that. And currently farmers are getting 12,000 rupees. So there's a huge outgo from the government system. And like that, there are 101 types of subsidies, fertilizer subsidy, food subsidy, different types of subsidies are there, supporting certain kind of agriculture that we are doing. And now we are in a situation where subsidies are eating into the money we should otherwise go into investments. If you again talk about the PM Kisan Samman only, the allocation for PM Kisan Samman in the previous budget, last year's budget, was 60,000 crores, which is 55% of the total allocation of the agriculture and farmers welfare department. So department के पास जो पैसा है, lot of money goes into salaries, whatever money left is going into subsidies. So subsidies also eating into productive investments, and farmers are therefore suffering from lack of investment also, in terms of lack of electricity, lack of water, high cost of fertilizers. All those things are also they are facing. So this is, in short, I mean, very brief kind of overview of what farmers are going on facing in India. Now I hand back to Richa to speak about what could be the kind of way forward. Over to Richa. Thank you.
Okay, so I'll very briefly talk about agricultural markets, primarily because the three farm laws were about these agricultural markets and reforming these markets. And just to give a brief sense, the mandi system that the three farm laws were trying to deal with, the mandi system is based on this Agricultural Produce Marketing Committee Act, and many of the states in the country adopted this act in the 1970s, the idea being that we wanted to curtail the power of intermediaries or these traders. And traders typically belong to specific castes within rural society. They had a lot of power. Many of them were money lenders. And so the idea was, how do we give a platform to farmers where they can come, they are protected, there is some form of accountability, and they can sell their produce. However, over time, these mandis also came to be controlled by many of these trading families in many places, not all places. And they created these oligopolies again over finance, trade, processing, transport, money lending once again. So the idea was that post-liberalization, how do we transform these marketplaces such that farmers may have better options in the market? The government opened up online commodity futures markets. There was contract farming that was tried out in many places. The e-chopals that I studied in my own book were an example of this. But again, it turns out that when we look at private marketplaces, companies are primarily accountable to their shareholders and not to farmers. And the kind of bargaining power that farmers may have had with traders from their own rural space was perhaps better than the kind of bargaining power they would ever have if they were trying to negotiate with companies, large companies like ITC, IBT. And just very briefly, in terms of the three farm laws, they would have enabled large corporations to hold much more inventory. They would have created, in some ways, it was a way to bypass the mandi system. But what our report and our findings are trying to argue is that one needs to reform the mandi system. You can't throw out the baby with the bathwater. You need to improve the accountability of the mandi infrastructure and the mandi institution towards farmers rather than shutting down mandis altogether. So finally, in summary, what we are trying to argue is that the current model of farming is pushing farmers into a web of risks. They're on this technological treadmill. They're fighting against nature in trying to grow a single crop on their farm. For that particular single crop, they are highly dependent on agricultural scientists to develop new seed varieties, on companies to develop more and more potent chemicals and pesticides. They are unable in the face of climate change to deal with the problems that they are seeing on their farms because now they are dependent on scientists and corporations from elsewhere to provide them with inputs and to provide them with knowledge-based support. And this has also not actually responded to the issues of hunger and malnutrition in our country. The kinds of implications that we are seeing, we are seeing growing rise of anemia, for instance, which is deeply linked to the transformation in our agriculture and the transformation of the food system that we have seen. Next slide, please. So the alternative vision for rural and agrarian India that I will not unfortunately be able to go into much details about, but the
Sure,
principles.
can I request you to maybe we could stop here at this point because otherwise we'll not have enough time for question answers. So, so we have two questions that have been posted online. Maybe Viju and Richa, you can respond online to them as well. But we can take 2-3 questions from the audience. Any of you, we can pass the mic here. One here. Anybody else? Just introduce yourself.
Do you want to answer this question, Shambhu, on the question on farm income, whatever in the chat box? You want us to answer the question, or you want to type out the answer?
You can answer it live, but let's take the question.
Yeah.
No, because
okay.
Let's take the human questions here. The ones online, if it is possible, respond online. But we just collect 2-3 questions together. Yes.
Yeah.
Hello, good afternoon, sir. My name is Anushka. So I'm not an agri graduate, so I may have the question may not be that insightful, but when you talk about what's the state of
keep the mic a little closer so it's easier to hear.
Yes. Am I audible now?
Slightly better.
Actually, it's not so much the mic. Those of you who have the question might have to come closer to the web camera to pick up the thing. But go ahead, shout out.
Okay,
Who else has a question? Yeah, come down. Yeah.
So, should I also come in?
No, just go ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah, just go ahead. It's okay.
So the question that I have is.
Yeah, go ahead.
The question that I have is about when you were talking about state of agriculture in India. You said that in agri now women have been involved more compared to the men because men are migrating. So with that, you also talked about that telling farmers and women farmers, like women are not considered as farmers. So how do we can solve this as a problem? Because women are in that occupation, but they are not counted as farmers. So how will that work?
Thanks, Anushka.
Yeah. All three are excellent questions. We can go on about it, but anyway, let's hear some more questions. Yeah.
We do. Let's take 2-3 questions together.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
Please come here so that you're. Yeah, just to let you know, Viju and Richa, it's fine if we share the presentation with them later. Is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely fine. Absolutely fine. Yeah. And Shambhu, you can also send our emails if they want to write to us directly, but that is fine.
Do that.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So, you have your question.
Hello, good evening, sir. Ma'am, I'm Ayushi, and in the beginning, you talked about beauty cotton, and I wanted to ask your opinion about how it changed the post-green revolution agriculture scenario.
Okay. Where are you from, Ayushi?
Chhattisgarh. Hello, sir. So my question is that we were talking about sustainable agriculture and how exactly the transition can be done, considering that we are in the post-green revolution phase. So my question is how exactly is the sustainable agrarian transformation, which will take up a substantial amount of time, help in solving the problem of indebtedness of farmers? Thank you.
Okay, thanks for all 3 questions. Vijay and Richa, please go ahead and respond to them.
Yeah, I'll first answer the question, then I can hand over to Richa. You can deal with the other question on BT cotton, etc. Sudhi Sheshadri has written in the chat box a question about farmer income. See, farmer income in India was not estimated for a very long time. I think first estimation was done by the current Niti Aayog member, Dr. Ramesh Chand, I think somewhere around 2011-12 or something. And his broad finding was that farm incomes were in very bad shape between 94 and 2004. And after 2004 till about 2012, nothing to do with governments. I'm not linking to any UPA, NDA type of government. There's a figure that he is mentioning. And mostly because of global factors, I think 2004 and 2012, farmer incomes really rose very fast. But subsequent to that, 2012, farmer income growth has slowed down. This is what the data indicates. Now, government is put up a committee called under the chairmanship of a person called Ashok Dalwai, with a former agriculture secretary. He has produced a massive report, some 14-volume reports. Anybody interested in the kind of issues we are talking about must look at those reports. They are very comprehensive and very good. A lot of rich data they have. So in that report, it was written in the context of the claim that we want to double the farmers' income. But as you know, farmers' income has not doubled. Now we can blame it on COVID or whatever it is. That income doubling has not happened. Now coming to the second, but that report one can look at, which actually gives you the historical data on farm income, the volume 1, the first chapter of the volume gives information. Then we go to the other the part of your question, which is about, has the income from wage labor exceeded cultivation income from farming ever before? It has never happened. That is exactly the reason why I quoted the 2019 report. Before that, there have been 2 surveys. 2003, there was one survey of situation assessment. 2013, there was another survey of farmer assessment. Both these surveys showed that cultivation is important, is giving a major part of the income. Wage labor is important, but it's not so important, not the major share. But in 2019, we find that the share of wage labor has exceeded all other categories. And now farmers are earning over 40% of their income from wage labor. So I hope that point is clear. The second point is about surplus labor. Nizar Vadama has written about surplus population. Surplus population, you are saying, is a concept derived from the West, etc., which may be true. The concept of disguised unemployment was not invented in India. It may have come from outside. But look at agriculture, what I just now mentioned. Agriculture in the country as a whole, agriculture, I mean agriculture and allied occupations like livestock, etc., put together, they contribute to 16% of the total national income, total GDP of the country. And how many people are engaged in it? 45% of the population are engaged in these operations or occupations. So we have a situation where 45 people together are producing 16 units of output, and remaining 55% together are producing 84% of the output. So there's a huge difference in productivity between farm and non-farm, isn't it? That's what I mean by the term surplus population. Now you can see whether it is right or wrong, or farmers should move out or not move out. All the discussions are there. But historically, 2 things are very clear. No country historically, with the US, Western countries, or Indian examples, or Asian neighbors, they have ever become modern or developed or grown unless when people move out of agriculture. When this agriculture to non-agriculture shift happens, that countries are not progress at all. That's the one broad fact that one can look at. Second broad fact is that while it's true that farmers are surplus and they should move out, what that effectively does is to increase the income of the farmers who are staying in agriculture. So no country, industrialist country, has succeeded without making the farmers rich. So both these propositions are linked to the issue of surplus population, which is mentioned here. Third one is the issue of women's labor. What you just now asked, the question that was asked about feminization. There's a lot of growing literature on that. We can go into it a lot more. What it basically means is that people, when they migrate, all the male members migrate, and women, because of their household work and because they have to tend to their children and take care of the old people, parents, etc., prefer a certain kind of work which is closer to their home, and they choose not to migrate. So most of them get stuck in agriculture, which is a phenomenon what we call feminization of agriculture. That's very much happening. If you look at the data, it shows that. And noted scholar Beena Agarwal has written a lot about it, which you can read about. The book by her called The Field of One's Own, which is more about women's land right, but it also shows how women are getting stuck in agriculture. Okay, Richa, I think you can take the question on BT cotton.
I was not able to hear the question on BT cotton. Can someone briefly summarize it for me?
So we might have to close the session, Richa. So can you briefly respond to whatever you heard from the students?
No, I couldn't hear the question at all.
Okay, fine. So what we'll do is, I'll try and repeat the question to you separately. But I think the students have had a fairly long day. So
I can see that they are having quite... I think they have heard enough of this rural India. I think they now want to go to rural India. They don't want to hear about it anymore.
Yeah. So
fair enough.
which is that we'll just take, I'll formally close the session so that some of the
Okay.
students, yeah. Yeah, so, you know, they have to pack, and I think they also have a Garba celebration tonight, which they're eagerly awaiting. So, but a few of you, if you want to continue to listen, we'll keep it on for a while. You can clarify your questions. So thank you all for your time and your patience. And we'd like
All
to
the best for your field trip. All the best for your field trip.
all the
Yeah.
best for your full visit. And we will share the presentation with you as well as the questions. But for those of you who want to have some clarity on the questions you asked, yeah, can you come closer and raise the question again? I don't think. Come closer here.
No, ma'am.
Yeah, go ahead, go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about BT cotton and its effect on the post-revolution agriculture scenario. BT cotton.
What is your question exactly? What are you asking about BT cotton?
Its effect on the post-revolution agriculture scenario.
Okay, broadly, I'll give you just a very quick, brief summary. But there's a very nice book that you might like to read, which is by Aniket Aga, called Genetically Modified Democracy. That does a very nice overview of genetically modified crops broadly in India, looking at both BT cotton and BT brinjal. What's important to note is that the Green
Richa, if I
Revolution
may
is not-
interrupt, there's an equally good review by Richa of that particular book in a publication called the India Forum. You should read that. It's a brilliant review she has done. Yeah, thank you.
So the one big distinction between the Green Revolution and GM crops.
Just a second, Richa. Yeah, those of you who still have to take attendance, etc., either do it silently or please do it outside the room. The discussion is going on. We are hardly able to hear anything. Yeah, so ACADCOM members, please handle that separately. You don't want all of this getting recorded live, right? Yeah, Richa, please go ahead.
Right. So the most important distinction is that BT cotton or any kind of genetically modified crops are only being done in non-food crops. The Green Revolution was about food crops. And at least until now, in terms of farmers' fields, genetically modified seeds have only been done in non-food crops like cotton. The logic of GM crops, and especially the logic of BT cotton, perhaps if you're familiar with it, is to incorporate a certain gene within the plant itself that is toxic to certain kinds of pests, especially the American bollworm. But what you see in the pesticide treadmill, right, which I mentioned earlier, that when you spray a pesticide, 90% of the insects die, 10%, which are the really, really resistant ones, will multiply. And then slowly that pesticide will not work anymore. And then you will need a new pesticide to deal with the same problem. The same issue has been seen in BT also. So first, a certain kind of BT1 gene, CRY-AC1, was incorporated into the cotton crop. And then eventually they realized that the pests had now become resistant to that. So they were eating the plant and not dying or not getting hurt anymore. And so then they came up with a BT2, a Bolga 2. And so that treadmill of, more and more potent kind of either genetically engineered crops or more pesticides is still the same treadmill that farmers are on. In fact, if you look at data, Glenn Davis Stone and Keshav Kranti, who was the head of CRRI, the Central Cotton Research Institute in India, they have a very nice paper which shows that actually pesticide use overall has increased by the end of it all. And whatever yields that we saw that were more in after the coming of BT cotton, they were really because BT cotton came in hybrid varieties which required irrigation. And the hybridization and use of water already will increase your yield. How much of that yield increases because of the BT aspect of it is not very clear at all. And so that's, I mean, if you look at Aniket Aga's book or Keshav Kranti's work, you will find the technical aspects of BT cotton, which, bring many, many questions about whether this technology is actually solving the problem it's supposed to solve, or whether it's simply delaying the problem and, adding to it in the long run. Because again, ultimately, all GM crops are also monocultures. It's about taking the diversity from the farm and growing a single crop and making sure all your nutrients are saved for that particular crop. But nature doesn't work like that. Nature works on variability, because if you have one single thing in nature and one pest or one insect or one disease, the whole thing is wiped out. And that's a real problem. I mean, in the logic of natural selection or the various other kinds of biological logics that exist, they depend on variability. And that fundamental thing is what we are fighting against. We don't want variability on the farm when we are trying to do monoculture. And that's why it's a race, and that's why it's a treadmill. So until and unless we get off the bandwagon of monoculture, bring back diversity on the farm, we are not going to be able to actually solve any of the problems that we are seeing in farming.
Yeah.
Another question that I had was of the last slide, I guess, that was about subsidies and public investment. I'm not audible. Okay.
You can.
Okay. So what I'm talking about is that the last slide was about subsidies and public investment, and in that graph, during 2002 and 10, the subsidies and investment both went down, and after that it increased. So what was that particular reason that pushed people and the government to give subsidies and to have investment in the same area?
Sorry, I wasn't really able to clearly understand the question.
I think the reference is to the slide on decline of subsidies and public investment. So both of it seems to have gone down and then it increased. So she's asking for an explanation for that.
I think Viju might want to take that particular question and dig up that slide where the subsidy.
Yeah, I'm just looking at the slide.
Yeah, I think it's the early 2000s is when.
Yeah. So if you look at the slide, I mean, you can see the slide
I
in
can show you
the
slide actually. So maybe you guys can see. Let me try and share it.
You can share it here. Please go ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you see it?
Yeah.
The brown colored line is a subsidy, which was low in the beginning of the period, which I think is 1980, 81. It was very low, and investment was a major thing. And over time, as the country progressed, as agricultural expansion happened, and farmers also started demanding more and more of inputs as a consequence of the Green Revolution model, subsidies started going up. So major part of this is fertilizer subsidy. There's also power subsidy given to irrigation and so on. And there's also food subsidy, which is part of it. And these together became much more important than investment. But over time, all this translates into a budget. Government has to finance its deficit, etc. If there are subsidy burden is too much, then government will not be able to balance the budget. The government will have to tax more, which I think has its own problems, and government's other sources are limited. So over time, the pinch began to be felt on the government's finances. So government had to do something about fertilizer subsidy and other subsidies as well. So that is why you see a declining trend or slightly going down line, because subsidies became unsustainable over a period of time. And even now, fertilizer subsidy is just growing only. The COVID has actually reversed the curve. The curve, I think, stopped somewhere around 2018. Post-COVID, the subsidy has shot up again very much. It's now around 2.5 lakh crore or something, as I could say. That is the subsidy that we are having right now. So this change from subsidy to investment happened mainly, as Richa was saying, 2000 to 2015 kind of period. But after that, state governments and central government started feeling the pinch of the whole thing, that the subsidies are eating into the money that they have. They started to reduce subsidies by increasing the fertilizer prices. People who are familiar with the rural area would know that the DAP price some 10 years, 5 years ago, 8 years ago was around 600 rupees. Now it's around 1200 or 1400 or something. So increasing prices are way of
she's also
cutting down
asking
the
about the dip in 2001 to 2005. So 2003, 4, 5, there is a slight dip.
That specifically, I don't know. That we need to look at. I am not clearly clear about that particular dip, why that happened. But the last kind of dip is what I'm talking about. That happened because of the budget squeeze. because the budget was not adequate, and the budget was not adequate for investment also. So investment also declined. But post-COVID, you have a very different scenario. The subsidies have grown, I think, much faster, and investments have stagnated. So you have the situation. On the left panel, you have all the subsidies listed out there. And you can see the fertilizer subsidy is the one which has phenomenally expanded in the last 10, 15 years. And the major reason for that is the model that Richa talked about, the Green Revolution model, which is heavy input intensive kind of model.
So just one explanation possible is that the fertilizer subsidy is linked directly to the oil prices. So it fluctuates accordingly. India imports about 85% of its fertilizers from other places. So therefore, the Russia-Ukraine war has been a big hit. And that's where suddenly from 1,30,000, I think we've gone to 2.25 lakh crores subsidy and so on. If you want to maintain the same kind of price. Any other questions from your side?
Question regarding the agricultural improvements and sustainability. Like if we are going for emphasizing on sustainable agriculture, in the long term, it will take a lot of time. And how exactly?
Yeah. So the question, you are Anushka, right?
So I am Anushka.
You are
So
Sonal. So Sonal's question is that if you want to make the shift, it's going to take a very long period of time. So that's her concern. So Sonal, a very quick answer to that before I hand it over to them. This is precisely the theme on which we are organizing this international conference. So it's not possible, as you saw in certain cases, Sri Lanka is often quoted, where suddenly they made a switch. So if you have to transit from, the kind of crisis situation that's mentioned, to a different kind of system, what does it take to move towards a transition? And there's a lot of literature on sustainability transition. And I think part of the interest in the conference is to try and get people working on sustainability transition. Most of the people working on this have not been working on agriculture. So to get scholars looking at those frames, looking at institutions, and what does it take to try and move towards? So suppose you're talking about natural farming. What are the investments required in maintaining, training the people? Because there should be a behavioral change for farmers as well. So how do you bring about behavioral change? How do you train community resource persons? Because the mode of extension is no more from, a public extension system or a private extension system, but farmer to farmer. How do you invest in capacity building of farmers? What does it take? What's the experience, let's say in Andhra Pradesh or in Himachal? What is it we can learn from Sikkim? These are the kinds of issues that we'll be addressing partly. And most of the participants in the conference will be talking about some of these. But Richa and Vijay, you want to add to it?
Yeah, Richa can say something and I can add later. Or you want me to go first, Richa? Okay, so if you the transition, as Shambu mentioned, into any form of sustainable agriculture, whether you call agroecological farming or LISA or whatever, any form, SRI, it's a time-consuming and slow process. And it cannot be the mandate of the farmer. Farmer can't decide that I want to do whatever I want to shift and all that. It's not in her hand. It's a lot of factors, the host of factors, most of them related to policy, many of them related to financing, many of them related to training and capacity building, human resource, as Shambu just now mentioned. A long, major effort is required. This shift to natural farming is by galti se, uska naam ho gaya this, what you call the zero budget. It doesn't mean that the transition can happen without any money. If that is understanding that one is getting, it's not going to happen. You need a lot of public investment there also, and you need also preparation of the community, etc. It's a very long process. And what is majorly required is also to do something about the subsidies that we are giving. It's not a level playing field. Level playing field means where people are on equal footing. The agroecological alternative and the conventional or the green revolution alternative are not on the same plane. Conventional alternatives are heavily subsidized. Urea, for example, you are getting a bag of urea for 250 rupees, but actual cost price of that will be much, much more. The difference between them is exactly the fertilizer subsidy. Similarly with DAP, similarly with other things. So these are heavily subsidized, therefore. The whole power regime also, groundwater crisis in India has become very important, very serious because of the power subsidy. The power is given free to farmers. That also causes a lot of issues. So the growing subsidy is actually the reason why the new model, the green revolution model, is being sustained over a period of time and propagated. And similar subsidy, similar support is not available for conventional alternatives. So till that happens at a very highest realm of policy, government is making a lot of statements about natural farming, etc. You can hear in every day or so some new things are coming up. But if you actually analyze for the last 5 years, what has been the investment in sustainable agriculture or alternative agriculture from the government, it's very, very miserable. A simple figure I'll quote, just one figure only. After that, I'll stop and ask Richard to continue. The PM Kisan scheme, which is actually a cash transfer scheme to farmers, 6,000 rupees per year per farmer. The total allocation for that is 60,000 crores. Compared to that, the allocation in the previous union budget of for natural farming, because what they call natural farming or parambaragat kheti or whatever they call it, that's hardly 500 crores. So that is the kind of difference that you have. Unless these things are corrected, these alternatives are not going to take off. Yeah, Richa, please, over to you.
Yeah. I mean, if we can just take it, maybe the previous slide in terms of, some of the alternatives. I guess the slides are no longer available. That's fine. I mean, the only thing I really want to add is somewhere that, we need a paradigm shift in thinking about agriculture as not an economic activity alone. Currently, all of our framing is, first it was productivity, now it's become income. But it's assuming that agriculture or industry or any kind of economic activity exists outside of physical material limits of nature. That, we have unlimited raw materials that we can extract, and there's unlimited amount of pollution that we can send back into the system, and the system will continue to work. Well, already climate change is showing us that it's not going to continue to work. It's seriously going to come back, and already is coming back to affect us. So, there's a lot of debate and discussion around the concept of degrowth, but somewhere fundamentally, the ways in which we evaluate what we do in agriculture has to shift from an individual centric approach. So that's what, when we are saying, populism, it's fine to support farmers and people who are in need and distress. That's certainly necessary because we are the one who have pushed them using these models into situations of distress. But getting them out, it's almost like, you've taken away the pond for the person who wants to fish, and then you're giving them, chota fish every day. But how long, where is the fish going to come from? So how does one actually begin to revive that pond itself? How do we begin to revalue our natural resources and revalue? I mean, and it cannot be done unless we work through a collective process. One single farmer who wants to shift to either organic or natural, wants to do something with the soils, but that farmer is surrounded with a sea of monoculture around them. Everybody else is spraying chemicals, everybody is growing one thing. That one farmer can't do anything. I mean, they may try. I mean, they're big farmers, rich farmers, they can perhaps try to do something. They may have investments in space and land and all of that, but the majority of farmers cannot. So they have to come together as a collective. You have to have some contiguous units of land. You have to work at a landscape level to figure out, okay, what will actually work? What is the slope of the land? What kind of pests and diseases are working? What kind of market arrangements can we make? And unless that is done locally, one cannot hope to transition. And I think increasingly people are recognizing that, because see, the Green Revolution approach was standardization. You take this one seed and it will work wherever. Make sure you give it the same amount of water, fertilizer, whatever. But people are realizing that's really not working anymore. Customization is the answer. And for customization, then you need more localized research. There was another question in the Q&A about agricultural research. From centralization and commodity-centric research, we need to get into agroecological and region-specific research and try and understand what will be the entire pathway for a region like Belgaum or for a region like Bikaner, which will be very, very different for a region like Anand and Gujarat, right? So those pathways have to be evolved bottom up and ground up. And you have to move from individual to a collective. So this individual welfareism, even though we may say we are giving 6,000 rupees to the farmer can choose. They can, spend that money on natural farming or, paying more laborers or buying bio inputs or something. But again, unless and until the farmer has a supportive ecosystem, that's not going to be able to work. And hopefully, as we are recognizing that and we are moving towards that, then some of these indices that we have described on this particular slide are ways to evaluate agriculture in a different manner. Rather than simply through productivity or just only through individual incomes, but rather, collective logics about health, collective logics about soil health, collective logics about nutrition and diversity, care for one another. I mean, degrowth is a very interesting paradigm, which also talks about, how do we, instead of, I tell my students at IIT Delhi a lot that, when will come the day when individual packages that students have received at graduation are not announced in the newspapers, and people are not applauded for those 1 crore packages, but they're actually applauded for doing something collectively or doing something for other people. I mean, as an ethics of care in our society, how do we begin to value that rather than individual income and individual so-called progress and growth? I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Richa and Viju, for a very insightful introduction to the state of rural and agrarian India. I think we've learned a lot from it. I'd also like to thank all the online participants. Some of your questions were answered, partially, some perhaps not so. What we'll try and do as a follow-up is we will share the presentation, also the contacts of both Richa, Viju, and Vasvi, so that some of you can, take this conversation online. My sincere thanks to both Richa and Vijayshankar for agreeing to do this at a very short notice, and to all the participants who are not here right now. Some of them are still here. And all the online participants. I think some of the ideas on new indicators and metrics, there's a separate team in the panel where we hope to have some insights on how this is going. So thank you very much for your time, and we'll be in touch.
Thank you, Shambhu, for your invitation. It's been very interesting to talk to people. And as we go along, we can have more such conversations, especially we are going to be in a conference in November. So we'll have more occasion to discuss with whoever is interested.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Yeah. Bye-bye. Yeah. Bye.